Welcome to The Edge. We have Harvey Kaye from Green Bay. My God, the Bears must be going sick just to know that you're here.
Well, they're Chicago retirees here, I imagine.
They're a big contingent.
I see there are a lot of Steelers people here, too.
There are a lot of Packers, a lot of Steeler fans and so forth. I go to a group on every Sunday during the season, and we curse at one another. But Harvey, tell me a little about yourself. You're an author. You've written some books along the way. You're a professor at University of Wisconsin in Green Bay.
Right.
You were interviewed by Bill Moyers, that means I have a privileged guest here, in 1980. And
no, 1980.
Well, that's what it says in your own bio.
No. 1980. That was 2008. At Moyers, it was 2008.
Well, I've had it. I just printed it out of yours, but we'll correct that right now.
2008.
2008.
And then again in 2009. Moyers was a big Thomas Paine fan, huge Thomas Paine fan. So he and I got friendly around that. I grew up in the New York area, and I went to Rutgers University and studied history. I went to the University of London, a London School of Economics, to do politics. Came back to the United States and ended up doing my PhD at Louisiana State University. And then my wife and I basically headed back to the north and ended up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I tell people I went to Green Bay for the university and I stayed for the Packers.
So you got there and the cheese was waiting for you, right?
The cheese was waiting for me, absolutely. And no, I've been in Green Bay now for more than 30 years, 33 years I guess it is, and at the university. And I originally was working in Latin American studies, and then I did some European studies, but I, for some time, have been working on American radicals, American progressive politics, American history, and Thomas Paine, who was my childhood hero, has become one of my adult subjects.
Give us the titles of your books.
Well, the early books I wrote were on a group of British historians, a group of British Marxist historians, well-known figures named Eric Hobsbawm, E.P. Thompson. I did several books on them, a couple of them authored. And then in the 1990s, I decided the only way to make a difference in the world was to work on American studies. So I did a book entitled The Powers of the Past, which looked at Ronald Reagan and his use and abuse of history in his speech-making and his politics. I did a book, I co-edited a book titled The American Radical, which is 45 biographical portraits of American radicals from the time of the American Revolution right through to the 1990s. Yeah. And then I did a book, Why Do Ruling Classes Fear History? But the books are numerous. And the books that have really mattered of late have been a young adult biography of Paine titled Thomas Paine, Firebrand of Revolution with Oxford University Press. And the claim to fame book, you might say, is Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. And that book is my love letter to America. That's my book where it's biography of Paine and then a retelling of American history in terms of Paine's vision, his memory, and his legacy.
He wanted to have what happened to this country.
Paine was the first of the major figures of the Revolution who really did call for independence, for a separation from Britain. But in his vision of what America, the United States, could become, he projected the making of a democratic republic.
As opposed to?
As opposed to perhaps some kind of aristocratic republic where the property would have aristocratic titles and basically govern their regions. He said, never used the word democracy in his great pamphlet Common Sense, but he actually laid out a vision and actually a plan for an American Constitution that was decidedly small d democratic. Democratic in the sense that at least a universal manhood suffrage, separation of church and state.
And separation of church and state is pretty significant.
That was very significant because especially at that time, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and others wanted to make sure that a revolution that they would participate in would guarantee their rights despite the fact that in New England the Congregationalists might have dominated,
the
old Puritans, and in the southern states perhaps the Anglicans who became Episcopalians. And so these Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Catholics and Jews got involved in the revolution because on reading Common Sense they envisioned a democratic republic where everyone, regardless of their faith, was equal as a citizen. So Paine himself was a deist. He believed that God created the universe, and if we're going to appreciate God's creation. We have to study the universe in a rational and scientific way. He was not a member of any church. He was raised, well, his father was a Quaker, his mother was an Anglican, and he himself grew up and became a deist.
You're coming to Sarasota because of?
Well, for several years now, we've come down, my wife and I, to join Florida Veterans for Common Sense to celebrate this coming Saturday, January 29th, Thomas Paine's birthday. And Florida Veterans for Common Sense was organized about 8 years or so ago, as a way of addressing the needs of veterans, as a way of addressing what they feared was a series of Bush initiatives that threatened the Constitution and led us into wars in which a lot of people would pay a price, and yet we would not all share the sacrifice.
What's the difference between, since you're suggesting the war situation was a war of choice as opposed to need, or that's an intimation I'm hearing, between the attack of 9/11 and Pearl Harbor?
First of all, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor was an attack on the United States, and so too was 9/11. But when Roosevelt and the American people responded in 1941 to that attack, they responded universally, so that the draft was shared by all. Taxes were raised, taxes were raised, and in fact they were raised not only heavily on the rich, but equally on working people. Roosevelt had given a series of speeches in which he said, if we do not all have the opportunity to don a uniform, we have many ways in which we can share the sacrifices, not only by serving in defense industries, but by way of USO, by way of the Red Cross. I mean, he talked about...
But the food was rationed in those days.
And there was, of course, rationing. There was a black market at the same time, but there was...
Gas was rationed,
rationing.
all these things.
After 9/11, Bush spoke in terms of, America committing itself to the defense of freedom, which was a wonderful ideal, but he then turned around and asked for his Republican-dominated Congress to cut the taxes, which of course meant cutting the taxes, especially on the rich. So as a consequence, not only did we have a war that was calling on people to give their lives and to make sacrifices, but also telling other people that, don't worry, you not only don't have to sacrifice, just think in a Bush administration, you're going to be better off. I mean, call it ironic, call it tragic, it's clearly lunacy to run a government and pursue overseas initiatives in that fashion.
So people who put the little, I support the troops on there and don't pay taxes are a little bit hypocritical, wouldn't you say?
I'd say it's glaringly hypocritical.
Glaringly, okay.
Yeah.
You're writing a book on FDR. You're in the process of it.
Right.
What's the title of that?
The title is Four Freedoms and the Promise of America.
Four Freedoms.
The Four Freedoms was a speech that Roosevelt gave January 6, 1941, long before we were directly involved in the war in any way.
Speech.
A fireside. Well, it was actually a State of the Union address. It was not a fireside. Well, it was a State of the Union address, which of course everyone then would hear. He had given a fireside address in late December of 40 on the arsenal of democracy. And so that fed right into the Four Freedoms.
Of democracy.
The idea was the United States might not be directly involved in the fight against fascism and Japanese imperialism, but it didn't mean we should stand by and do nothing. We could become the arsenal of democracy. We should rev up our industries and afford, especially the Brits, the necessities of war, okay, the military necessities, so that in essence we would provide a lend-lease program. So we would lend them the equipment, they would eventually pay us back. We wouldn't ask for the money right up front necessarily. We would be the arsenal of democracy. But in the speech of January 6, 41, Roosevelt lays out the vision of what America would hope for after the war. And the assumption was, and by the way, most Americans believed we would end up in the war even though they didn't want to go into it. And he said, what we envision is a world based on four freedoms. Freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And those became the ideals for the United States war effort. Mm-hmm. And by the way, they were also the ideals that provided the basis for the GI Bill, and also for another remarkable speech that Roosevelt gave that I also will talk about in the book, the Second Bill of Rights speech. In January 44, in a State of the Union address, Roosevelt laid out the possibility of a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights for Americans, to make sure that all Americans are properly housed, all Americans are properly fed, all Americans are properly covered by national health care. I mean, this is 1944. Think about how many decades ago that was called for by Roosevelt. And by the way, 85% of Americans, when polled, endorsed that vision. And even 75% of Republicans endorsed that vision.
The Republican Party was a little different in those
Well,
days.
the Republican Party did not endorse the vision, but Republican citizens endorsed the vision. That's the sad thing.
At the time the war began in 41, there was about 150,000 people under arms of any kind.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers.
But it's a low number.
It's a relative. Well, here's what the draft was already in place. But I want you to know, the Republicans voted against the draft. If it had been up to the Republicans, we would have been attacked at Pearl Harbor and completely incapable of responding to the Axis threat. They were isolationists. And they said, if we build our military, then we might be attacked. Well, Roosevelt knew we were going to be attacked.
Well, they were the reason that he couldn't go after Germany. He couldn't help Europe when they wanted him to.
Right. So anyhow, the military numbers were small. But of course, in the course of World War II, 16 million Americans served. I think 350,000 of them women. 1 million African Americans. I mean, I can give you the numbers. It's really quite amazing.
Well, he personally, when the time came to, when the war was declared and he acted as president, he gathered the industrialists around him and basically said, this is what you're going to do, Ford, so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, I mean, he set up basically war production boards. I mean, the case was that the industrialists hated Roosevelt. Okay, they hated him because during the Great Depression, he basically took the side of working people and enabled working men and women to organize unions, allowed farmers to organize and control price boards. And in fact, by the way, industrialists themselves were not keen on going, in this instance, many of them were not keen on going to war. They were eager to start producing cars for citizens, not tanks for the military. But when the war came, Roosevelt basically read them the Riot Act, and they got on board. And in fact, their profit levels skyrocketed during the war, so they did quite well during the war.
I think they worked round the clock, and everybody went to work, and that was a great...
Right. American wages went up significantly, especially because they also set up a National Labor Board that guaranteed workers would have at least some cushion on wages, and the overtime provided for significant
I think it was under
income.
Roosevelt that they began the overtime situation. With
overtime, minimum wage, all of that is...
Yeah, right, all that began under him. I think they went to a 48-hour work week at one point.
Well, it was a 40-hour work week in
40?
the late 30s.
Was it 40?
Yeah. But then during the war, they allowed for the breaking of those kinds of things.
So that changed that.
Yeah, the 40-hour work week, which was struggled for in the late 19th century, when Samuel Gompers led the AFL, didn't really come into place until the Roosevelt era.
Well, the story was that people were on the street selling apples, and the various shops and the factories and so forth were running around the clock, the same people doing all the work and nobody being employed. So then the people...
The American economy in 1932 was devastated, absolutely devastated. And although mistakes were made during the New Deal, Roosevelt's policies through the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, through the PWA, the Public Works Administration, through all of these initiatives, afforded working people a chance not to receive payment on a dole, but to go out and work. And by the way, when we look out across America, most of the roads that we drive on were built during the Roosevelt era, except for the interstates. When we cross bridges, except for the ones built post-interstate, those are often built during the Roosevelt era. I mean, we forget. Well, the Republicans right now have the Roosevelt legacy under siege. And right now, America is in its own way involved in a sort of nonviolent civil war because Republican conservatives
You're making a real attack on the Republican Party.
I can tell you right now, I think we're at a turning point in American history. And I think it's the case that if the Republicans had their way, we would be back somewhere like pre-World War I America. And I can also tell you that I'm not making a case for the Obama administration. I think we need a far more progressive kind of politics in this.